Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Hey y'all, if you are in the northern hemisphere, I really hope you've been enjoying this incredibly delicious autumn weather we've been having. For sure, if you live around me in the Midwestern US. This episode will be a little different. I want to update you on a few things, including some of the books I've been reading, some interesting conversations that came out of a reading I sat for recently, and then for the bulk of the episode, Susan Davy will join us to talk about Danny Robbins and all things uncanny. If you're here in the States, you might not be aware of Danny Robbins or the absolute craze he has started in England right now, and I bet you'll be interested. So definitely stay tuned for that. But first, it's no secret that I love reading, and probably like many of you, the majority of what I read is nonfiction on paranormal or metaphysical topics. Every now and then, I get the urge to pull out an older, shall we say, vintage book on parapsychology or mediumship. Well, years ago, I believe it was our friend and parapsychologist, Dr. Callum Cooper, who recommended an old book by Dr. Richard S. Broughton called Parapsychology, the Controversial Science. It was written in 1991, so this one really isn't that vintage. It's not too heavy or overly scientific, and it's actually often used as a textbook for parapsychology courses. So it's a great introduction to parapsychology and what that is. My favorite part of this book was the last few chapters that dives into the future of parapsychology, at least the future looking at it from 1991. A lot has changed since then, so reading that was fascinating. But the book also covers some of the frustrations that the field of parapsychology has had. Their fights to be respected and being a legit science, and struggling to find the funds and support to continue the work. And if you've heard my present day interviews with people like Dr. Callum Cooper or Lloyd Auerbach, you know that this struggle for parapsychology continues. Richard Broughton, the author, later served as director for the Institute for Parapsychology, now known as the respectable Rhine Research Center, from 1995 to 2000. And that Rhine name is going to come back into our conversation here in a few minutes. Dr. Broughton is still around, and Callum Cooper gave me some contact information. So I hoped to be able to connect for an interview, but as of yet, I haven't heard back. So cross your fingers. I think it would be a really cool experience to talk to him. Again, this book is called Parapsychology, the Controversial Science, and it actually references and led me to the next book that I read and want to talk to you about. Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, a critical appraisal of the research in extrasensory perception. And there are several authors of this one, but the main name you would know is J.B. Rhine, who first wrote about ESP in 1934. That book, simply titled Extrasensory Perception, is the book that was really groundbreaking, and so I'll be looking for that one next. But this particular book, sometimes just referred to as ESP 60, is the follow-up and was written in 1940. Now, for me, the experience of reading this book was a completely different story. It was a delicious read in the sense that, OMG, I'm reading some of the earliest serious words typed on a page regarding parapsychology, but it's full of graphs, numbers, symbols, math, statistics, and probably 90% or more of this book went completely over my head. as I hoped to gain some knowledge kind of unconsciously by simply running my eyes over the words and numbers. It took lots of breaks and naps, but I eventually finished it and proudly had the shelving ceremony. Ironically, my favorite part of this book, if there was a favorite part, was kind of the same thing from the last book in 1991, except they were talking about the future of the study of parapsychology, ESP. And really, they saw it as more, it's going to be into the machines. Everything was going to be mechanical, the machinery that was going to be involved in testing ESP and robots. And, in the earlier 1900s, the machine age, like assembly lines and things like that. So that was fascinating. If you happen to find a vintage copy of this book, Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, a critical appraisal of the research in extrasensory perception, it'll probably look really pretty on your bookshelf. But unless you're into numbers and statistics, or have a way higher IQ than I do, or unless you're Cal Cooper, hi Cal, I wouldn't recommend reading it. So that's my book discussion. Now I want to tell you about a reading I just had. I heard from a listener named Jen Piwowarski, and she said she was a budding evidential medium and was looking to do some practice readings and asked if I was brave enough to sit for her. Now, I've had a few people ask to offer practice readings to listeners in the Big Seance parlor, and I always say, yes, I think it's super cool. So I said yes to receiving a reading. So I won't tell you a lot of the personal details about it, but I can tell you that Jen is lovely, and the first word that came out of her mouth was an obvious hit to me. And there were other elements of the reading that I feel could be communication from one or two family members in spirit. But a few things that came across inspired me to have some conversations with living family members. One of the things that came through to Jen while communicating to who we think was my great-grandmother in spirit was the image of an old crystal cake stand. Well, this meant nothing to me, but I talked to my great aunt, who told me a story that I think I remember hearing, but had forgotten. My mother was pregnant with me at the time, and after a holiday meal or a family get-together of some kind, she was helping to wash dishes in my great-grandmother's kitchen. My great aunt was also there. One of the items waiting to be washed was my great-grandmother's cake stand. Suddenly, without being touched, my aunt said that the cake stand just cracked off of its base. She remembers this so well because the cake stand was to go to her after my great-grandmother died. And as if that wasn't strange enough, a moment later, a glass flew out of a cabinet above them and crashed to the floor. My aunt remembers learning about poltergeist phenomena around that time and how it could happen around new and expecting mothers. Well, isn't that interesting? Well, after talking to my aunt, and this is kind of a tangent, but hang on, I remembered an old story, which was passed around over the years, that happened on that property, which consisted of an old farmhouse, a barn, a pasture, and another small home my great-grandmother built. All of that land is within walking distance of beautiful bluffs that overlook the Missouri River. Over the years, my great-grandmother lived in both the farmhouse and the smaller home, which the cake stand story took place in. But the story, as I remember it, went somewhat like this. A farmer in the 1930s or 40s supposedly shot and killed his wife in the dining room of a big farmhouse, and then went off and killed himself in the woods or in the barn. By the time I was born, my great-grandmother rented the old farmhouse and lived in the smaller home on the property. So I don't have a lot of memories from the inside of the farmhouse, the dining room where he supposedly killed his wife. Although I did dance and entertain the family on the massive front porch. But I do have lots of memories, both of the woods and the barn. One of my earliest memories was being stung by a bee near that barn. I also remember camping and sleeping in a tent near that barn. I remember going down to the creepy cellar where my great-grandmother stored her canned pickles and preserves. I spent lots of time staring and mooing at the cows in that pasture, and also stepping in a few cow pies, if you know what I mean. And I watched my dad cut down dead trees for firewood as I played in those woods. Now, I haven't been able to verify either of the deaths online for sure, but my mother suspects that the part about the wife being shot might not necessarily be true, as the tale was told and embellished over the years. Who knows? But we're pretty confident that there was a farmer who killed himself somewhere on the property, whether it be the barn or the surrounding woods. Now you might ask, does the family still own that property? And the answer is no. But I do have an aunt and uncle who live only about 100 yards away from that property in a newer home that they built on the land where for most of my life, my great-grandmother actually later lived in a different old house, one with its own interesting story. So my great-grandmother moved like 3 times, but not very far. It was basically on the same land overlooking the river. But anyway, that other house, that's a story for another time. So anyway, now I'm thinking, could that have anything to do with the poltergeist activity that happened on that old property? The cake stand cracking and the glass flying out of the cabinet? It's interesting, the conversations and memories that are brought up in a simple mediumship reading. So thank you, Jen. Oh boy. Well, now I need a drink, so I'll get ready to pour the tea for our conversation with Susan Davy. We're going to talk about the absolutely addictive British craze known as Uncanny and its creator, Danny Robbins. But I want to give you just a quick heads up, because in this conversation, we mentioned the book Into the Uncanny, which Susan actually sent to me from Australia, and I've been reading it. But I just realized that I don't think the Dead Tree version of this book is actually available here in the US, at least not yet, though you can find the Kindle and audiobook version on Amazon. Okay, here we go. Y'all, I have a very special person with me. Some of you are going to know this name and this voice. And if you're a longtime listener, you might not realize it, but you know this voice because Susan Davy is probably one of the longest listeners we have. And she was, if not the first, maybe the second, I don't remember, maybe she does, but if not the first person to call in on the hotline. And if you didn't know we have a hotline, it's been a long time since anyone's called it. And that hotline is 1-775-583-5563. And it's mentioned in the outro every time. I know a lot of people probably don't listen to the outro, but it's in the outro. You could also think 7755 tell me. And it's been a while since anybody's called. Hint, hint. But we do have a hotline, and she called in, and I put her voice into the show, and she has and I still think this, and I am lucky because I consider her a great friend whom I've never physically met, but all the way from Australia, often gives me the most lovely messages, audio messages, where she uses her voice to just tell me what's going on in her day and give me lovely wishes for whatever is happening. And she also tries to convince me to follow really cool crazes, which we're going to talk about today. But before we talk about that specifically, welcome Susan Davy from Australia.
Thank you, Patrick. It's lovely to be talking to you again.
Y'all, isn't that the most lovely voice you've ever heard? And we might hear some Australian birds singing in the background. They're so lovely, and I almost hope they do, because that'll just bring the cool Australian ambiance into the interview. So this is just a last minute thing. I just decided. I messaged Susan less than 24 hours ago and said, here's my idea. Will you meet me online to do this? But there is this show, a BBC show out of the UK called Uncanny by a gentleman named Danny Robbins. And Susan has been telling me about Danny Robbins, and I did not know the name. I didn't know anything about Uncanny. She sent me like some links and some images, and I'm seeing the imagery going, that's weird. I don't know that person. I don't know anything about it or what it is. And she said, oh my gosh, you are going to love this. I'm going to send you the book. And so the book arrived on my doorstep. It's a lovely book. It's beautiful. It's this, I can't wait to, I'm making my way through the book, and I can't wait to have the shelving ceremony and put it up. And then I realized, oh my gosh, she has a podcast and all these other things. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but I am now sucked in. I am completely sucked in and binging, and I don't think a lot of Americans know about this. And so I decided that Susan was such a really great person to convince me why I needed to jump in. And so I decided she needs to come on the show because she has such a great way of describing this. And so now you can become obsessed and get sucked in too. So Susan, just tell us about Uncanny and Danny Robbins and why we need to get sucked in.
Well, just some context on me. I'm actually a librarian by trade. So I'm the person who's always going to be recommending good reads and good listens to you. And in particular, I stalked Patrick saying, you have to listen to this thing. It is absolutely fabulous. Not only does it have amazing production values, which I know because Patrick's so skilled at production. This is brilliant storytelling. And I thought about this last night, how I would express what's great about this to you. I'll start with the podcast, but Danny Robbins is a writer by trade, and he puts the people at the center of the story. We've become a little bit acculturated to putting the place at the center of the story, right? We know our list of haunted places. I could name 10 big haunted places in America and in Britain and Australia. But Danny is going to the people stories, and he's starting there. And also he says, I'm a skeptic who wants to believe. But he believes that whatever they're explaining happened to them. So belief's a funny thing, right? Like, I saw my coffee cup this morning, but do I believe in my coffee cup? How do you put that? How do you express that? And so in the podcast, he sort of goes through those topics like belief, but he listens intently to really extremely credible witnesses. And I want to use the word witness because he does take almost like, I want to say police procedural approach, but that's not quite it's an investigation procedural approach where he gathers the evidence and then establishes the credibility and the belief, and then they test theories around that. And you're really left to decide, but these are extraordinary stories of amazing things happening to ordinary people. So that's the key reason. It's people are at the center of this. It's not I'm going to the building that's haunted and I'm going to look for ghosts. These are people that have had the experiences, and he says that there's a few things that will always resonate with him. And one of the things is the people are still scared. It might have been 40 years ago, but they're not totally over it. So the veracity of the stories is amazing. So I love that. People are at the center. He's empathetic and he's a fabulous listener, which puts him up in the realms of Patrick, by the way, but he does hold space. He's empathetic. He doesn't test anybody. He doesn't sort of come from a point of view that people are attention seeking or they're grieving. These are people that have just had this mad experience happen to them out of nowhere. So he also sort of explores the idea that we've forgotten how to talk about ghosts, and he says that in his book. And I think, I go back through the old newspapers, librarian and all that. But if you go through our archives in Australia and you type in ghost or poltergeist, or there's lots of local stories back in the day when we wrote up all those stories. So there's a big public record of weird things happening, and we don't talk about it so much anymore, I don't think. And it's a strange club to be in, to be someone who has actually seen a ghost or had something strange happen, or if you've seen a full body apparition, what do you do with that knowledge? Where does that go? So the podcast is absolutely fabulous, and you will be hooked.
One thing that's really unique and cool about the podcast is that as people hear these, it's very story driven, and the production value is crazy, and the music, and you will get sucked in, and you will sometimes be frightened, but they're real stories. And so I'll use the example of the room 611. Where is room 611? Do you remember?
I certainly do. It's in Allenbrook Hall in Belfast at a university. It is the first episode, and it's unforgettable.
Yes. So there's all of these people who have stayed in that, dormitory, students. And as this podcast has become so big, and that's like the most popular episode, people who've had experiences have now contacted and called in. And he doesn't just say, oh, that's neat. He follows up, and then they will revisit it. They've revisited it multiple times as they get new additions to the story and new experiences. And I think that is cool and fascinating.
That's right. He co-opts you into the cases. And when you do read the book, he sort of structures it as cases. And even the episode list for the podcast is cases. So he's taking you along in the investigation. And as he processes this stuff, he talks to you, and he talks to himself. It's like, the guy who tells the first story, the memorable line in episode 1 is, bloody hell, Ken.
Hashtag bloody hell, Ken. Yes.
And he'll say, hang on, I think I need a break. Like, he's listening to these stories and he's got to step out of the room and process them. So, he builds a case, and everybody's participating. And it's not just the people who are prepared to accept that it's a paranormal experience. The skeptics weigh in saying, that could have been a squirrel, or, hey, that could have been infrasound, or whatever it could have been. But there's also, it gathers people who've had the same experiences. And in that first episode, it is truly compelling because it's a bunch of, people who have gone on to be science nerds and geneticists and, doctorates and stuff like that. You wouldn't say they're true ghost believers, but they've had this experience, and they're still, in library world, they're still trying to sense make it. And it's not quite the realm of belief, but they know it happened. So fabulous stories.
And for Americans in particular, if you're tired of the same old stories, the same old locations, because we do have a lot of them that get regurgitated and covered a lot on every show. I don't think he's had any cases here in the States yet, right? They're all outside of the US, I believe. So it's fresh stories.
There's one lady, she's a British lady. I think she came to New York to model.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
In Brooklyn. Yeah. And it's spooky as all get out.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So, it is very addictive, and your listeners are going to hate me, and because they are going to be addicted. And then he's got a couple of other podcasts if you go before that. If you listen to Uncanny, which is now up to season 3, before that is The Witch Farm, which is fabulous. And before that is The Battersea Poltergeist. That's a little bit more like a dramatization, but it's also fabulous. And before that, he started on a haunted podcast, which is where people started sharing stories, and now it's a worldwide phenomenon. So there's lots of stuff to go on with, and I had to share the book with you, and I cheated. I'm a bad librarian. I listened to the audiobook. But the audiobook's very satisfying because it's like a 9-hour episode of Uncanny.
Is it his voice?
It's his voice, and it's really great. And he does a really credible Australian accent. I don't want to spoil anything. But also, he once again, he talks you through it. It's just like, this is going to scare the shizzle out of you, or hang on, I need a break. So you're on a journey with him as he unpacks it. He, as I say, explores belief. Where does that come from? The young guy in the library who's reading Usborne Book of Ghosts, or the, Unknown, Book of the Unknown, the old Usborne books, and watching Scooby-Doo. And I kind of love somebody whose interest starts at that point, because I find that very relatable, both as me and as a librarian.
Yeah. Well, he's not afraid to be funny. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And for sure in the book, he talks about how this all started during the pandemic for him, this uncanny stuff, as many people did during that time when you were shut in and needed to find a way to be creative. And he talks about how his wife and children, they made him, if he was going to do this, he had to fix up the shed in the backyard. So he actually does his creative podcasting and storytelling in the shed.
Yeah.
I think he used the term, he said, because his family said that he was not allowed to do the freaky deaky podcast thing in the house.
Right. And I love the vision of him down the bottom of the garden in the shed doing his freaky deaky stuff. It's absolutely fabulous. And I don't know Danny. I'm just a massive fan. But, there's a certain quality in his voice that speaks to his humility and the way he relates to people in the stories, and also accepting that if you've had one of these kind of experiences, that it's a game changer. Where do you go from having those experiences? How it alters your world view? And some of the people, he talks to some pretty significant people, like the theatre producer, and this guy's had a massive experience. That's in the book. And this is an Australian guy, and he goes, and then things got fucking weird. And he says, he talks about doubling his laundry bill, for various scary things. So, I like his humility. I like his humour. Yes, he's got a history, as he says, a jobbing writer, but it really, the paranormal or the uncanny has provided him with almost an accidental, reason for everything. And he's just spectacularly good at it. And his storytelling skills, his listening skills, his theatrical skills all come into play. It's something really beautiful. I don't know if you've watched a lot of British telly, but they do a procedural really well. They do a mystery really well. Mm-hmm. Same in literature. They're really good at building suspense and not giving too much away, and the subtleties of the writing craft, I think. And that's really translates beautifully into the podcast. But it's not lofty. It's very accessible for everybody.
Absolutely. And there's like 2 years or more of content. And I've been listening to most of them as I go on my walks with the dog at night, which is very brave of me at night to walk. And we walk late at night. So there's in the fall around here, it's a spooky time to be walking and listening to Uncanny, but we brave it. And so hours and hours and hours of content. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the experts that they have on, because not every episode, but I think most episodes he has usually 2 complementary experts, one more skeptic, one more open to things, usually parapsychologists, things like that. And just last night in one of the more recent episodes, I heard our old pal Callum Cooper, who's been on the Big Seance podcast. So he was an expert, but there's also a young woman named, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's Evelyn Hollow.
Evelyn Hollow.
And I have just decided that I love her attitude and
gorgeous.
Everything she has to say. Yeah. And so everybody who's listening can put their energy toward this. I have reached out to Mr. Danny Robbins Peeps and also Evelyn Hollow. And I have heard back from Danny Robbins Peeps, and we're trying to work something up. So I'm not promising anybody, but put your good juju energy toward that. But I also would very much like to speak to Evelyn. And so I'm hoping to hear back from her as well. I just think that would be awesome.
She's fabulous. And I think she's a psychologist and parapsychologist. And there's Ciarán O'Keeffe as well. But she's got the same kind of empathy and curiosity for what's being told. And she doesn't need to debunk. She seeks to understand. And so really empathy is the word, but very smart and intelligent input, and really, really wonderful. When the others are sort of, vibing off on the infrasound thing, she's going, actually, I think there's something very strange happening here. There's a lot to be looked at here. And we've all heard that thing where, people say, oh, this thing happened, and you just sort of go, oh, that's interesting, but you're not really, that's interesting, but you're not really interested. She's really listening.
Yeah.
And so I so hope that interview comes off, because Danny and Evelyn will be fabulous to listen to in conversation with you.
I'm super excited.
Yeah, but you've got the same qualities, Patrick.
And everybody, Susan gave me the confidence to go right after all of that. And so she's been giving me good juju, which is probably why I got a response, my first response. So thank you for that. But everybody, if you do get sucked into this, if you get sucked into the podcast and liking it, or you maybe read the book, it's not going to be legally available in the States right now. But there's a TV show coming this month, right? Is it this month in the UK?
That's right. It's on the BBC. I think it starts on Friday the 13th. And it's Haunted, the television show. And also Danny and Ciarán O'Keeffe and Evelyn Hollow are doing a theatre show where people actually tell their stories in a theatre environment. And just because it's in the theatre doesn't mean it's not true. But it is. It's taking ghost storytelling out of the realm of the pantomime. And I think I'm not sure, I haven't seen it. He did have a theatre show on the Ghost Story 222, I want to say. But the current thing that he's going to tour from the end of this week is like a reality conversation thing in a theatre. And I love those kind of theatre experiences, I've got to say, because watching somebody tell a story and talk about it is always really powerful, or tell their story. So, yeah, but the show starts this week, I think, on Friday the 13th. And it'll be on BBC iPlayer. And, hopefully it'll come mainstream with all of our shows at a future date, because it's going to be too fabulous not to, I think.
This thing is so big, they've even had an UncannyCon, which makes me laugh.
Right, exactly. And hashtag BloodyHellKen became a thing, a total thing. Ken has become an unintentional star, so it's great. Well, I think it's great in terms of how it adds to knowledge and understanding in the field as well.
Mm-hmm.
You often hear people talking about, things, not much new is happening. Everybody's running around with K2 meters and whatever. But there are people who've got something to say that have had an experience, and there's something to be learned in that space. And you're right about the pandemic project aspect of it, where, our homes, which were lovely and comfortable, and you suddenly became, where we were stuck. And he explores the idea that ghost stories often sort of start fermenting in times of great world change. We know about the crisis apparitions after World War I, and I guess World War II, the spiritualism and the boom around times of great change. And he kind of believes that maybe we're living through a bit of that now, but he's adding definitely a new kind of fresh voice in that space by listening to all the other voices and stories.
So since we have you here, I happen to know, because you've shared them with me, or at least a few of them, I happen to know that you have had some paranormal experiences. Yeah. And as you talked about earlier, you're really good being a library media specialist. You were very good at looking back at the old newspapers, and you were researching the history of one of the experiences that you have. But just share some of the paranormal experiences that you've had with us.
Well, I guess probably the big one that I had was a long time ago. I would have just got my license, which would have been in Australia, that would be P plates. And I was driving from the local McDonald's home, and I got my younger sister in the car. It's like late at night, we're hungry, let's go to McDonald's, which is, a great rite of having your license and popping your younger sibling in the car and we'll go to Macca's. In Australia, we call that a Macca's run. I don't know if that's what you call it in America. There was nothing big going on. We were hungry. We wanted the junk food, and we're coming home. And I sort of came to a crossroads, and at the crossroads, and I won't say totally exactly where, but, it's actually not very far from where I live now. This crossroads is quite dark, and very clearly on the right hand we could see a full-bodied apparition of a glowing figure of what looked like a man. I would describe a certain sense of malevolence in the way they looked, and they're about 100 meters away, but it was like they were looking through the windscreen directly at us. And this is what, this is wow, one of those moments. I hit it, and I can't tell you how fast I drove home. I'm around the edge, sort of country edge of my suburb. And we both raced up the stairs, and my mum thought, what's happened to you? What's happened? Something, there was this thing. And then I could see how terrified my sister was. And I said, I think maybe that was just, some ne'er-do-well in the bushes there. She goes, oh, bullshit. I've never seen you so scared in your life. I've told you, Megan and I have 4 degrees between us. We still can talk about it. We still, as the podcast says, we know what we saw. We can still remember it totally clearly. And I promise you, it's a long time ago. I never drive that way at night. I never want to see that again, whatever the hell that was. And so I thought about it. I thought, well, maybe it's us. Maybe it's an us thing. Maybe there's something, is there something after us? Was that for us? Was it about us? And it wasn't until it happened to the son of one of my friends, and he was just a young guy, again, coming into the suburb from the edge to get some dinner.
Same crossroads?
Yes. A little bridge just before at the creek that's mentioned in the article. And he said, Dad, you just ran over a man, and he said, what man? It's in the middle of nowhere. What man? And my friend's son actually drew a sketch of the face of the man that his dad had run over. And my friends showed me, and it's what we saw. It's what my sister and I saw. So being a librarian, I went into the archives, went into the online newspapers, typed it in. Lo and behold, for that location, there is a known apparition that was seen it's recorded in 1878. And not only did they see it, they got axes and tools, and they took a couple of swipes at it to try and get it, to get rid of it. And it sort of disappeared down
brings a new meaning to ghost hunter.
It does. Well, these are the days. There's a problem, we're going to go and sort it out. What's that thing? It is the same location. So this thing, I think, has been there for a long time. So that's both unsettling and a little bit comforting. It's not a me thing. It's not about me and Megan or my friend's young son. And I still have those pictures that he drew. And, he's in uni now. He's studying a science degree. There's nothing weird about that guy. And so it just happened. There was nothing going on. There was no grief. There's just people going to get dinner.
I would like to force you to go back a little bit and I'm feeling my inner Danny Robbins come out here. What about this apparition made you so sure it was an apparition? Like, what were the qualities of it that made you know this wasn't living human?
Well, it's dark. It's at the edge of our suburb near a golf course in probably 11 o'clock at night. And this thing was glowing in the figure of a man. And what we could make out, I couldn't tell you what it was wearing, but it just looked like maybe if they're from the 1800s, that would make sense. But the face and the look was not quite right, shall we say. This wasn't just an angry human being with a flashlight, shall we say. It was glowing.
It reminds me of the dream that I had about my apparition. Longtime listeners might remember I did a blog post about it before the podcast, but I think I may have even covered it in one of the old episodes. But, I've never seen an apparition, but I've always wanted to, like most of us, for forever. And I think my mind and God, somebody, gifted me a apparition experience in the form of a dream.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful. It was cool. It was interesting. And I picture it just like your experience of, it was a glowing, ended up being like a glowing vagrant, I guess. Is that a word? Yes. Crossing the road and having a kind of a liquor bottle wrapped up in paper. And it was a roadway from my hometown, actually, that I knew, and is a real place, but it's a overpass and there's a railroad underneath. And so he was going from one end to the other end, going down to the railroad. And I timed it the next night. And I said, well, I don't know how I knew it would happen at the same time. But the next night I went at the same time to have like a stakeout to see. And I got out of my car, parked my car. And sure enough, the exact same time the next night, here comes the apparition. And I got really close to it. And I could almost feel the resonating or the vibrations of this glowing thing going right in front of me, not knowing I'm there, just walking across the road. And it was just the most magical experience. And I woke up thinking, oh my God, I cannot wait to share this with people. And then you realize it's a dream. But even so, like, it was so detailed and it was like a gift to me. Like, I got to see my apparition, except I just didn't see it while awake.
Well, you did. And you're right. That is very similar to us. There's an overpass or a railway. There's a roundabout. There are graveyards on one side and golf course and bush on the other, but it wasn't in the graveyard. It was kind of in the bush. You could say it was like a glowing vagrant, but there was no bottle and it was glowing, but it wasn't happy, shall we say. And there was a feeling, an unforgettable feeling of malevolence. And I think in the Uncanny podcast in episode 1, these guys, the science nerds sort of describe it as an absence of light, a total, they're glowing, but it's not a good thing. It's just, that's what I said to you. This thing was not a good thing. I'm a pretty sane girl, and I've been in some, I've seen some pretty scary people in my time, but I've never seen anything like that. I have not seen any other glowing vagrants, glowing malevolent vagrants in my life, and I'm not planning on.
Well, for you to still reside in that area and never go back to that point is saying a lot.
Mm-hmm. I don't live that far, and as I look out my kitchen window at night, there's a little light out on the railway nearby, and I just lower my blind a bit so I don't even see it. I don't even want to think about it. And honestly, when I fall off my perch and somebody, looks under my house and sees all that, they're going to think it's like a classic horror movie. What was she trying to keep away? I'm thinking, whatever you are, you stay out over there where you live, not at Susan's place. No. So I'm glad it's lived where it's lived since at least 1878, and it can stay there. That's the end of my curiosity. But I guess this harks back to what we're talking about, what the impact of seeing that. I guess I'm over the shock. Megan and I were kind of never over it because it's unusual because it's two people seeing the same thing, same time. We're not in trauma. We're just two young kids going to McDonald's. But what do you do with that? How do you organise your worldview around that? You have to come to accept the idea that there is something else, that there is afterlife, or that, something survives, or there is a possibility of some kind of spirit energy thing. What is that? What even is that? But that's your starting point. So I guess that's what I had to work back from. And I became interested in like Leslie Flint, the direct voice medium, and also, of course, the skull experiment, like empirically proving these things, because I guess that's where I was at. And so, I haven't totally sought out experiences. I've been open to them. I certainly didn't seek that one out. But having some friends in that field now, because I live not far from a couple of, from certainly one large haunted location, I've plucked up the courage to be curious, despite that situation with the glowing thing. But yeah, I've got a funny one I'll tell you about. The person involved with it, but I won't say their name, but you'll be able to guess.
Uh-huh.
And so we're out, we'd gone on like a history walk, nighttime ghost wander through one of the local historic suburbs. And there's a tale about a church where, when the priest would go in, the doors would open and close by itself, and a tale about a stone seat at the back of the church being like a healing seat. And so the guys building the stories. And so we splintered away from the group, and we sort of stood near a columbarium behind the church. And my friend had his MP3 recorder. And so here's us, it's nearly midnight, it's cold winter's night in this country historic suburb. And my friend presses the button, and we go, are you there? Silence. And we did it again. Are you there? We waited. We played back, silence. I thought, this guy who apparently haunts the church had been a bishop. And I said to my friend, okay, I need you to say, are you there, Your Holiness? Because I thought maybe we're offending him by not using his right term, right?
Are you there, dude?
Yeah. Well, my friend said, what? I said, just do what I say. Just say it. And my friend said, are you there, Your Highness? And we played it back. So my friend misheard me saying, Your Holiness, and said, are you there, Your Highness? Which is what you might say to a royal family member. We played it back, and there was a man's laughing, and he was laughing like a happy Santa Claus. It was a very amused laugh, like, you pair of idiots. You don't know what you're dealing with. So that was a very, very funny one, and that also has been very memorable, and we still talk about it. It's embarrassing, but we certainly did that. And I've got a lovely one, a really beautiful one that happened at a local sort of stately home in my hometown. And, the Anne and Renata go and do tours there. And I went there, and I've got fabulous memories of this place going back to when I was a kid, because my dad was sort of a very prominent city administrator here. And I can remember sometimes he'd be phoned in the middle of the night to say the alarm's going off in this house again, because it belonged to the county, as it were. And so I'd always volunteered to go to this home to help him turn off the alarm. There's a few things I loved. I loved that it was spooky. I loved the fig trees and the hooting owls. And I'd go in there and I'd explore while he tried to work out how to turn the alarm off. And now I look back at that, the alarm was going off in the middle of the night by itself. So I was always going to have some kind of a destiny with that location. So I've always been curious of it. And I went there with Anne and Renata on one of their investigations, and I was upstairs in a really beautiful room. And Anne had set up the spirit box, and she was just chatting. This home, there's a pigeon pair home, exact replica built next to it. And there were two families there that lived happily next to each other, no problems, no dramas, no bad histories. And so she's just chatting about how they lived. And she said, this is such a beautiful home. I bet you had some really lovely meals here. And she goes, I bet you had some great desserts. What was your favourite? And I'm sitting there, and the spirit box said, blancmange. In a man's voice, in a cultured man's voice. And so you can't make that up. And it was absolutely fabulous piece of evidence, I think. So blancmange, I'll never forget that.
Some researchers they're offended when people in an EVP session ask such simple questions.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people, and yes, sometimes ghost hunters and people who are passionate about these things we do kind of turn it into like circus tricks and ask them to perform just because we get so excited about it. But sometimes I'm like, you know what? Those are still people. They're just not living. And they might want to talk about the desserts they loved or their favorite shows or their family members or things that got on their nerves. And so I love that. I love it.
Yes, that's right. If you can come to accept that things can exist or people can exist in non-physical reality, and that's, it's a lot to wrap your head around, and my head's not totally around it, and I've lent it a lot of thought because I've had to, So, what the ordinary, that's their life, right? Ask them. You don't have to ask them lofty questions.
Yeah.
And it's those strange experiences that will happen. They don't always happen, as Danny Robbins would say, in the stately home. There'll be those ordinary moments. There's a quote I really love of Joan Didion's that she says, life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. And, they're the moments. And your question, did I hear that? Did I really see that? What was that? And your first instinct will be not to believe what you saw or you heard. Mine always has been. And then you go, okay, hang on, that was, wow, okay, that was a thing. And I've got another, I guess, I live not far from a local haunted big location, which is the local jail. And it's a bit of a rite of passage to go there on one of the ghost tours. And in one of the way that long ago ghost tours, with different people running it, I can remember going there and I was standing on the gutter and I had a little meter with me. I'm going to go in there, I'll investigate. And I had a friend and I was standing just waiting outside the main gate, which has a large caged area that you walk through to go through into the jail. And I heard in my right ear, oh, I just went, and my friend Marg said to me, what's wrong? I said, I just heard in my right ear a mixture of what I will say is ha, 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 and a belch. And I'm thinking, will I go in or won't I go in? It was terrifying. Anyhow, I thought, Susan's going in. So I'm waiting in the caged area while the tour guide sort of starts the spiel. And I'd been to the hairdresser that day. And my friend Marg is, a few people a little bit away from me, but not a lot away from me. And she goes, Suze, your hair. And I go, yes, I went to the hairdresser today. It's very nice. And she, no. She goes, your hair. And apparently bits of my hair were being lifted up. Like, when you're at high school and you're playing with a Van de Graaff generator, a couple of bits of my hair were standing up. And I thought, wow, okay, right. So foolishly, we went through into there and it had a feel, shall I say. It always has a feel. But when we went into one of the older wings of the jail, my friend actually heard out aloud the ha, ha, ha that I'd heard at the front of the venue. And it sounded like it was coming through an AM radio. It's such a haunted site. If you go in there, you're going to have an experience. You will have an experience. Just you will. So I don't usually go there. If I've had to go there, sometimes I use it for conferences and stuff. I'll walk in and be very brave and walk out. So it's like, don't come near me, don't touch me, just nothing. I don't need to know. So yeah, that was that one. Oh, thank you for the compliment. Oh, yeah, my hairdresser did a fabulous job. Again, feeling like a fool. My dad used to, go to church every week, and he had a beautiful voice. He used to sing in the choir, and it emerged that there was a couple that attended his church that they had a haunted house, which is also not far from the jail, and it's a lovely old local house, but their ghost is a ghost that bows at the end of their bed, like a servant ghost that wants to help them. And so they both thought that they were going mad. And the husband had seen it and then the wife had seen it. It wasn't until they compared notes that they had decided that they were seeing the same thing. And so that was sort of spoken about, at the church, and my dad was quite perplexed by it. But I guess the longer he lived, the more he was able to accept that there were stranger things. So, yeah, the bowing ghost, but it's just one of those familiar things. It just happens in a historic house or any house, any location.
Well, you have a nice collection of experiences that definitely does help shape your thoughts on the paranormal. Thank you for sharing those.
You're welcome, Patrick. I guess that's why I enjoy listening to you, but I enjoy listening to a podcast where they listen and they go, okay, they can accept that this is actually what happened. Then you've got to think, what actually was that thing? There may not actually be an answer, but people do have these experiences, and it does alter your view. And then the work of a life is to organise what in your head. What does that actually mean? And I just accept it now. I haven't really got a choice. I wouldn't say I'm obsessed by it, but you kind of learn to live with it as a reality. And yeah, live in non-physical reality is a good way of putting it.
I want to give you the opportunity to give any final thoughts, but also I don't know if there's anything you would like to promote or just anything. I'll say we have a lot of listeners from Australia now, but Susan Davy is the first, I believe. And I just sure appreciate all of your support. You are a Patreon supporter. You are constantly in touch and always an inspiration for the show. So I appreciate you so much.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And I appreciate you. And I don't have anything to promote except I'm a librarian. We're non-commercial. But
go out and read. Get a book.
That's what I'm going to say to you. I really, as we've talked about with Danny Robbins, where he can say, I started reading these books at the library. Do go and read about the topic. And if your library doesn't have it, ask about it. I don't do collection development in a library, but when I did run a big library, I always made sure it had This House is Haunted by Guy Leon Playfair. And as a librarian, I try not to collect too many books because librarians know, there's the birds. Librarians.
Hey, welcome.
They are. Librarians know that you've kind of got it for every book we put on the shelf. We've got to take one off, right? So I try not to collect too many, but out in my shed at the end of the garden, you'll find David Fontana's Is There an Afterlife? Dr. David Fontana, who's sadly now passed. And, of course, the Skull Experiment, which everybody should know about and find out about. But read and learn. And Patrick's, I tell Patrick that his podcast is a fabulous library to me of some of the best current thinkers in this field of, is it paranormal? Is it just uncanny? What is uncanny? Something that we don't yet understand. And we talked the other day, and I said it's like Freud called it the unheimlich, the unhomely. He thought it was perhaps a distortion of the familiar. So what is it? Who knows? But your podcast really has so many touch points to people who are on that path and such a substantial body of knowledge. So I celebrate your podcast. I'm proud to support it, and I want that knowledge to exist in perpetuity because it's important for everybody to know. And I can't believe your generosity in letting me talk about another person's podcast as well as the book. So not affiliated, just a fan of you both. And, I hope people enjoy Uncanny, but everybody, put your wishes out there that Patrick gets an interview with Danny and Evelyn, because I know how much you're going to enjoy.
Cross all your appendages.
Yes.
And send some good woo-woo energy out there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. You rock.
You rock, Patrick. That's for sure.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how.
Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Thank you to the following super paranerds who support this show at patreon.com/big seance. Jennifer Scanlon, Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Josiel Lorenzo, and Susan Davy. My supporters at the parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Anne Rekovich from OzParatech.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Janae Michaels from Greyhouse Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Amy Park Gedicke of AmyParkG.com, Lonnie Scott from WeirdWebRadio.com, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Midge Munster from MidgeMunster.com, Heather N. of DancingBeeAlchemy.com, Diane Razmataz, Carla Overbook, Tracy King, Andrew Watson, Amy Taylor, Christine Rath Selhe, Mindy Kentop, Hope Battaglia, Cass Bailey, Melissa Armour, Janet Shaw Binns, Bruce Williams, and Christopher Kohler. And I currently have 4 awesome listeners who support the show at the $10 level, which isn't even a thing. Those awesome paranerds are Glenna Becker, Steve Skinner, James Wilfong, and Peggy Hagen. I also have 3 awesome listeners who support the show at the completely made-up $20 level, y'all. And those awesome peeps are Norman and Linda Keller and Kevin Gilbert. Thank you, paranerds.